Welcome to the FreeBalance Academy. Welcome to Module 3 of the FreeBalance Academy's Revenue Management course. This module is a discussion of the functions of the FreeBalance Accountability Suite's Revenue Management module. Through this module, on the revenue management's functions, participants will learn about the revenue voucher, understand debit notes and credit notes, learn about revenue receipt vouchers and bank deposits. Let's learn about the revenue voucher. The revenue voucher function is the main function used to account for the collection of non-tax revenue. The revenue voucher is usually recorded for the collection of non-tax revenue, deposit accounts and surcharges, or for the sale of goods or services. Revenue voucher contains detailed information of revenue collection such as revenue transaction, amount, tax amount, payment method, payment location, payment mode, treasury bank account, item details, payment details, etc. Revenue collection and recording has three major processes. Assessment, which is conducted outside the system. Collection of revenue, which is the actual recording of revenue in the system. And acceptance of revenue, which will be conducted in the FreeBalance Accountability Suite. Revenue generating departments and revenue collecting departments will be using the revenue voucher for collection of all non-tax revenues, deposit accounts, surcharges, and sale of goods and services. This allows the government to account for the receipts collected on a daily basis. The collected revenue will be deposited at the bank on a daily basis and reconciled with the Treasury. In case of foreign currency revenue, the revenue will be updated with the currency received, and the exchange rate as maintained by the Treasury with daily rates from the central bank. In case the revenue needs to be written off, the data entry officer will reverse the revenue voucher and update the revenue voucher with details of write-off. Once the revenue voucher has been approved, the FreeBalance Accountability Suite will reverse the transaction and write off the revenue by offsetting it in the general ledger. Government receipts are collected by revenue-generating departments and can be deposited as cash or paid directly at the bank. To navigate to the revenue voucher, go to Menu, Revenue Management, and Revenue Voucher. We are now in the search mode of the revenue voucher. To look for any existing vouchers, we can fill in the filter criteria and select the Find button on the top right of the screen. If you want to create a new revenue voucher, select the New button on the left of the screen. The revenue voucher is very similar to the expense voucher with a few exceptions. Let's take a look at the fields. First, we have the code. This is the unique ID given by the system for each revenue voucher. Next, we have the fiscal year and the fiscal period, which is related to the transaction. Following, we have the date field. This is a system-generated date based on the revenue voucher that is being created. Next, we have the institution and the collection agency. The system, by default, picks up the institution of the user's employee. If the user has access to more than one institution, they can change the institution that is related to the revenue voucher. The collection agency is a third party that would be collecting the revenue on behalf of the institution. We can use the Lookup button to select the collection agency. Next, we have our first supporting entity, the revenue voucher classification. For the time being, we're going to select the sales proceeds and charges classification for this exercise. Next, we have the revenue voucher type. We can either have cash or credit revenue vouchers. For our first exercise, we're going to select cash. Next, we have the workflow status. As we're just starting off, the workflow status will be created later. This will change as we go along the approval process. The next three fields are related to the posting status. We can either temporarily save the revenue voucher, in which case it will give us a template number, or prior to doing that, we must provide a not posted reason. Once it is saved, the posting status will appear as saved. Next, we have the origin of the revenue voucher. As we're creating it manually, the current origin is manual. However, if it is externally sourced or created automatically, the origin here will change. From the externally sourced revenue voucher, we can see the external source voucher and the batch number are also generated by the system. Now, we are going to select the customer. To look for the customer, we can go to the lookup. Either use the filter criteria or do a generic search. Here, we can select the customer that we require for the particular revenue voucher. Now that we've selected the code, we can see that the sold to customer and the customer name also appear. The next two fields are related to currency. The default currency set in the system will appear first, however, the user can change the currency as required. If it is a foreign currency, the configured exchange rate will appear here, and in the amounts, the foreign currency amount will also be calculated. The next fields are related to templates similar to some of the vouchers that we've seen before, like purchase orders and expense vouchers. Revenue vouchers could also be created as templates. We need to select the Is Template checkbox here and provide a name. Once the template has been created, it can be used over multiple periods. Recurs on next period will create a copy of the revenue voucher for the next period. Next, we can see several fields that are related to amounts. These are all auto-populated based on the information that we included in the revenue voucher tabs. We can see that the domestic and foreign amounts are provided, along with the taxes, any received, outstanding amounts, and information from the debit and the credit notes. We already know the journal voucher will be created for approved expense vouchers. Similarly, approved revenue vouchers also create journal vouchers. The auto-generated journal voucher will appear here. Next, we can see the paid status. Currently, the system is configured that the revenue voucher will only appear after the payment is made. Therefore, the paid status is Yes. The next few fields we are familiar with, as we've gone through them in the expenditure module, the payment method, location, category, and treasury bank account. Based on the payment method, some of the fields that we enter in the revenue voucher payment detail will also change. For this example, we are selecting cash. The payment location is where the revenue voucher is being paid. If there is a sales payment type, we can include that as well. Next, we have the payment category and then we have the treasury bank account. This is the bank account that is related to the revenue voucher. The offset code and payment terms become mandatory in the revenue voucher if it is a credit revenue voucher. We can take a look at these fields in our next exercise when we are creating a credit revenue voucher. If the revenue vouchers are related to correction invoices, these three fields will be filled. When the cash revenue voucher is linked to a bank deposit, the system will auto-populate the bank deposit number and the date related to the revenue voucher. Next, we have the Created By information. We have the ID of the person who creates the revenue voucher along with the date. We have a few other details that could be filled in if necessary. However, the description is mandatory. Now that we have filled the details in the header screen, we can go to the tabs. Let's start with the revenue voucher items. Select New to enter a new revenue voucher item. In our introduction, we mentioned that there could be something just linked with the revenue vouchers. In the case of a subledger, you can include the institution code, the subledger type and the subledger code accordingly. However, as this transaction is not related to a subledger, we do not need to share this information. We can go to a first mandatory field, which is the description. You must also enter the unit of measure, unit price, and the quantity. Once we have filled these details, we can enter the coding block. You can either use the elements view, or the lookup, or enter the coding block manually. We have several other tabs within the revenue voucher item. If there are any taxes involved in the transaction, you can add a pre-configured tax into this voucher item. You can look for the tax. Select the required tax such as VAT, and we can see that the tax percentage and the amount gets calculated automatically. For this transaction, we're not going to use any taxes. We can also attach any attachments or documents and pictures. If the revenue voucher is related to a correction, journal voucher or refund, those items can also be linked here. We're going to return to our header screen and go to our next step, which is the revenue voucher payment details. We can see that the item has already been populated here. Let's take a look at the detailed information. The serial number will be auto-populated based on the information provided. Next, we have the payment due date. The default date that appears here is the date that is currently in the system. We can change the date of the payment if required. The payment amount is also given here. In addition to that, we can add interest rates or discount rates based on this information. The interest amount and the discount amount would also be auto-populated. As a result, the net payment details received, outstanding, total outstanding, debit, and credit notes would also get updated. The reference number issuing bank and check date are related to revenue vouchers that are paid through checks. We can take a look at how these become mandatory when the revenue voucher payment method is a check. If it is related to a credit card payment, we can fill these details out which are related to credit cards. The payment details could also be related to receipt vouchers, credit notes, and revenue debit notes, in which case these need to be filled. Once we have the information we need, we can update and return. Now that we have filled in the information, we can save this revenue voucher. We can see that a new code has been created. This is our revenue voucher code. We can now send the revenue voucher through the workflow transition to be approved. To approve the transaction, we must log into the approver's account. We can go to the internal messages and navigate through the revenue voucher and send it through approval. The workflow transition has been executed and the revenue voucher is now approved. We can now scroll down and take a look at the journal voucher that has been created. All the information that is populated here is based on the revenue voucher. We can see that the automatically generated checkbox is ticked. This is because this journal voucher is created through the revenue voucher by the system. We can also see that the origin is an invoice. The source document number is the revenue voucher that we just created. This is a double entry related to the journal voucher. We can see that the revenue code is credited, and the bank account is debited. This is what a revenue voucher related to cash looks like. Let's take a look at how the revenue voucher would change if the revenue voucher type was a credit. Let's go to a new revenue voucher and select the same information as we provided before, except this time, we're changing the revenue voucher type from cash to credit. We're going to select the same customer. We can now see that the paid status is no. In our previous cash transaction, the paid status was yes. This is because it is a credit transaction. We can also see that the payment method and location are no longer mandatory. However, the payment category must be filled. In addition, we do not need to fill the Treasury bank account yet. However, the offset code and the payment terms have now become mandatory. As the offset code is a payable code, we must enter the code that we need to account for, which is the payable or receivable account. We can look for the offset code through the lookup button and select the code that is related to the voucher. Next, we must also include the payment terms. Similar to our previous transaction, we can enter the revenue voucher items. We can enter the description, the unit of measure, the price, quantity, and the coding block. We can save and return, and we will check the payment details. We can see that the information that we've provided prior have appeared here. Now we can see the revenue voucher. We can see that new code has appeared related to this revenue voucher. Similar to the cash transaction, we can send this through the workflow transitions. Let's understand the concept of debit notes and credit notes. A debit note is an adjustment to an account. A debit note is created when a change is made to a transaction that has already been saved. We are going to start with a debit note. Let me log into my account and navigate through the menu, Revenue Management, Debit Note. We're creating a debit note. We can see there are a few details here. We're going to enter the collection agency, which is my institution, and the customer. We're going to use the same revenue voucher that we used for the credit entry. We did a partial payment, so it will still be available. Right now, our customer is ABC, and we have a few amounts that are available here. We have the amount, tax amount, total received, and outstanding. This revenue voucher is still not approved and therefore, no journal voucher entries created. Now let's select Test 1 as the debit note classification. We can select any payment method. The payment status is no, because we have not received it yet. We're going to process payments by entering bank details, offset code, payment terms, and add a description. Now, we are going to add a debit note item. Here, you can see that the amount, coding block, and description are available. In addition to the debit note item tab, we also need to add the revenue debit note applied item tab, which is mandatory. Before we do that, we can enter the amount and coding block that we used in our revenue voucher, a description, and if any taxes are relevant, we can add them here. We're going directly to the revenue debit note item. Select New, and in this window, we're going to select the relevant revenue invoice that we want to amend. Let's go to the lookup and we have our credit note here, number 69. Right now, it's a partial payment of $13,000. We are also going to select the payment detail. We had only one payment detail there. Now, you can see that within the revenue voucher, the original amount was $13,000. Revenue voucher total domestic was $13,000, and paid, or received, $8,000, and the balance was $5,000. When we selected this particular revenue voucher. This is our revenue voucher and we are going to select the payment detail. Under the applied amount, we can enter how much we are going to revise the particular revenue voucher, and we are going to increase it by $1,250. You can see the net domestic amount that is relevant for the revenue voucher be adjusted here. Let's make sure the domestic amount and the amount within the debit note is available here. Let's view the payment detail and update if it requires any changes. The reason why we don't need to provide the check details is because we're considering this to be receivables, and we have not received the check details yet. Now, we're going to save it. We have our debit note detail, but right now, we don't have any journal vouchers. That's because we have to send it through the workflow transition. So we're going to send it through approval. Let's check the internal message for the debit note. Let's go through the transition and approve. Once approval is done, we can see that a journal voucher has been created, and we can go into the detail. All the information is based on the debit note increase that we've entered, and the source number is our debit note. When we go into the details, we can see we have credited sales and proceeds charges, which is our revenue account, which means our revenue is increasing now and we've debited the receivable. This is the same journal voucher entry that we saw when we were creating our revenue voucher. The same receivable is getting debited, and the revenue getting credited would also be created at a debit note stage. The reason is we're going to increase the revenue voucher through our debit note. To see this, we can navigate to our revenue voucher screen. We are going to copy the revenue voucher item from here. You'll first see that there is a debit note adjustment for the domestic amount. Under the payment detail, when you navigate to the serial number, you'll see under the debit notes, we have a new applied domestic amount here. The same amount will also be reflected under the debit note adjustment domestic amount. This will be available and similar to how we received a revenue voucher. Now, we can go to our receipt voucher. Go to New. Details of the debit note appear under the receipt voucher items. We can select the information that we selected before. Earlier, under the revenue document type, we selected invoice voucher. We can now select debit note and apply the debit note that is related to that particular receipt. We can go through the lookup. This is the debit note we created, so we can select that. Now we can also provide the apply domestic amount, or how much we've received here. That will automatically calculate the outstanding amounts. If you want to leave a bit of a balance, we can do that as well. Let's see the balances. We can see that we have an outstanding domestic amount from this voucher for $200. We're going to save and return. Similar to our receipt vouchers, we can send this through the transition as well. We can send it through approval, and we'll see the variations that have gone through here and are available in our revenue voucher. A credit note is a means by which an organization can credit a customer for a transaction that needs adjustment, or was applied in error. To navigate to credit notes, go to Menu, Revenue Management, Credit Notes. Similar to other vouchers, we're going to enter the details related to our credit note, starting with the collection agency. We have the source, and this is manual. We're going to enter the customer, and we can also set it as a template. We can see the amounts available here and the journal vouchers. We don't have to set a payment category or location yet. Let's select an offset code. Let's add a description. Similar to the debit note, we can go to the revenue credit note item and add the amount, $900, and add the coding block that is relevant to our revenue voucher. Add a description, and under the credit note tab, we have to enter the revenue invoice. Here, we're going to navigate and select the invoice, and select the payment details. You can see now it's $5,000. That's because we weren't able to approve the debit note yet. Let's say, I want to reduce this by $900. Here, you can see that the debit note reduces the value of the revenue amount. We're going to save this record, and send this through approval. Now, let's log into the approver's account. This is for the $900 that we want to reduce from our revenue voucher that has already been approved. Once it's approved, we have a new journal voucher. In this case, we can see that the origin of the journal voucher is a credit note. Similar to debit note, when we go into the revenue voucher, we can see that the paid status is partial because we haven't paid the total amount. We now have our earlier debit note, and we also have a credit note, and the same information is available here. This is how the revenue voucher can be adjusted based on the debit and credit notes. Debit notes will increase the value of revenue amount and credit notes will decrease the revenue amount. But in the case of debit notes, you can create a receipt voucher for a debit note, but you can't create a credit receipt voucher for a credit note. That is because we are reducing the value that we're getting from our customer, not increasing it. Therefore, we wouldn't be receiving a credit note, because we are only trying to reduce the amount that they have to pay us. But in the case of a credit note, and the total amount is less, the amount that is payable from the customer gets reduced. When you already have a receipt voucher for a revenue voucher that has a credit note, you only need to pay the balance amount. In this case, because the credit note value was $900, and revenue amount was $5,000, now you only need to pay $4,100, and then your revenue voucher will be closed. In the case of your debit note, we had $1,250, so we would have to pay $5,000 plus $1,250. That's the difference between credit and debit notes, and it's a way of revising the revenue after the revenue vouchers are approved, which means that both of these two functions, both the debit and the credit notes, require a prior approved revenue voucher. You need to link your revenue voucher to the approved revenue voucher to the debit and the credit notes before you can proceed. Let's learn about revenue receipt vouchers and bank deposits. A revenue receipt voucher is a record of a payment made by a customer. The revenue receipt voucher function allows tracking of items or services for which a customer has paid, and applies the amount accordingly. To navigate to the receipt voucher, go to Menu, Revenue Management, and Receipt Voucher. You are now in the search mode of the receipt voucher. To look for any existing vouchers, fill the filter criteria and select the Find button on the right. Let's create a new receipt voucher by selecting New. We can see very similar fields to the revenue voucher starting with the code. This is the code that is unique to every receipt voucher. After, we have the fiscal year and period that is currently open, along with the receipt date. We also have the institution and the collection agency, followed by the workflow status, posting status, and the origin of the revenue voucher receipt. As it is a manual entry, we currently have manual. For other sources such as external sources, the following details will be generated. We must now fill out the customer information that is related to the receipt voucher. After we have filled the customer information, we can see the currency information is provided, followed by the templates, and the domestic amounts, which are auto-populated based on the receipts. Then, we can fill in the payment category, followed by the bank account information, which is the treasury bank account related to receipts. In addition, we can provide the offset code that is related to this transaction. The bank deposit numbers would appear here, and we have the created and approval details and other information that is related to the receipt voucher that can also be viewed. We now have to provide a description for the receipt voucher. Let's go to the revenue receipt voucher items to add the details. Here, we have the serial number which is auto-generated, the payment date, and the payment method. If we select Check, we can see that the reference number is mandatory. But, if we select Cash, we can see that the reference number now becomes not mandatory. That is because we must enter the check number under the reference number. Let's select Check and add the payment amount and the check number. Next, we can go to the revenue receipt voucher item details and select a new item that is related to this receipt voucher. Here, we must include the document type. You can have receipts either through debit notes or invoices. If it is an invoice, the revenue invoice becomes mandatory. We can go to the search button to look for any credit revenue vouchers that are currently available for payment. Once we select the revenue voucher, we can add the payment data related to the revenue voucher here. Once we've added the payment details, we can see that the payment amounts have been populated. And if there are any applied domestic amounts that could also be applied here, and the net amount is provided here. Once you're satisfied with the information, we can save and return to the Voucher Item tab, and save and return to get to the Receipt Voucher header screen. We can further attach any documents if required. Once we are satisfied with the receipt voucher details, we can save and get a new code related to the receipt voucher. Now we have to send it to the workflow transition to be approved. Now, we can send it for approval to the particular user, who will be authorizing the receipt voucher and approve the transaction. Now that we have approved the receipt voucher, we can see the journal voucher that has been created related to this receipt voucher. When we go into the details, we can see that the origin is now receipt voucher, and the source document number was the receipt that we just created. If we look at the double entry, we can see that the payable account has been credited, and the bank account has been debited. Further, we can take a look at the revenue voucher related to this receipt. The revenue voucher we have linked is here, and we can look at the details of the revenue voucher. We can see that it was a credit transaction with a journal voucher related to it. If we go to the payment details, we can see that the receipt amount is now the $1,000 that we received through the receipt voucher. This information has been updated, and the receipt voucher applied items have been linked here. As there is no outstanding amount, the outstanding amount domestic would be 0. We can also receive a partial payment. For example, let's assume only 750 rupees were received. The received amount would say 750, and the outstanding amount would say 250, which is the balance that is outstanding. This is how the system would record receipt vouchers related to credit revenue vouchers. The bank deposit function is a deposit of one, or a group of cash receipts previously issued into a bank account. In a typical scenario, cash receipts are received from customers, and a group of these receipts are deposited as one cash receipt bank deposit into a treasury bank account. Revenue collected for the day will be deposited at the bank by the accepting officer, and upon depositing the revenue, the bank will provide the accepting officer with a bank deposit number. The process of depositing the revenue, cash collected, will be conducted outside the system. Once the cash has been deposited, and the bank deposit number has been provided, the accepting officer will use the bank deposit function to update the bank deposit number for all the revenue vouchers collected for the day. Let's take a look at the bank deposits for cash receipts. To navigate to the bank deposit function, go to Menu, Revenue Management, and Bank Deposits. Here, we can see the Treasury bank account, bank deposit number, and dates are mandatory. We can go to the Treasury bank account and select the account related to the deposit. You must also enter the bank deposit number that is related to this transaction, and the bank deposit date. The receipt amount and the invoice amount are auto-populated based on the information we provide in the tabs. We can either select the cash receipt voucher or a cash invoice. To look for receipt vouchers, you can go to the lookup and search for any receipt vouchers which are pending. We can see that there is one receipt voucher that was created in the previous transaction that will be added. In addition, we can go to Cash Invoice and select any pending invoices which are cash related. We have added 2 items in the tabs which are displayed here under the receipt total amounts and the invoice total amounts. Once the information is correct, you can update the bank deposit. You will get a notification that says that the cash receipt vouchers are updated for the Treasury bank account. Once you select OK, the transaction will go through. You're able to see the bank deposits in the bank reconciliation that was done in the Treasury Management module. This concludes the module on the revenue management functions. See you in the next module.